Hey folks, I'm JC from One Shot Adventures, and this channel is all about running, well, great one-shot adventures, but also short campaigns. And while I enjoy writing a lot of my own adventures, which you can download on my website, I routinely take inspiration from so many of the amazing tabletop adventures that you can find on the web today. The amount of resources for GMs is truly amazing now versus when I first started in the hobby. And while us modern GMs have a glut of fantastic material, I find a lot of inspiration in older material. Adventures and supplements that were designed closer to the origin of the hobby we love. So sometimes when I'm short of my own ideas and looking for something new to inspire me or feeling a little nostalgic, I return to these old adventures to mine them greedily for goodness. The RPG hobby has changed a lot since those early days, but I promise you, you can still find some really cool, innovative content from the 80s and 90s that can be refreshed for the modern tabletop. And because this is the time of year where I try to bring the spookiest RPG adventures to my table, I went hunting for a classic horror adventure. Something that maybe has been lost to time, perhaps waiting to be rediscovered, run at a table and horrify my friends. And so today, we're going to cross the Atlantic together, head to Scotland, and discover the Highland Terror, an adventure written for the Chill RPG over 30 years ago. If you haven't heard of Chill before, that's fine, keep watching, because I actually ran this adventure with pulp Call of Cthulhu rules. But let me give you a little RPG history here first. In the 1980s, horror was just entering the RPG scene. Call of Cthulhu saw its first edition printed in 1981, and it was soon followed by Pacesetter Games' Chill in 1984. Now, while Call of Cthulhu really focused on cosmic Lovecraftian horror, period settings, and very fragile investigators, Chill was the game that tried to depict modern and classic Gothic horror. Players played agents of a secret organization that traveled the world and battled more traditional horrific villains from myths and folklore. Think ghosts and werewolves and cultists and mummies and, of course, evil clowns. Chill was definitely more pulpy than Call of Cthulhu, and a session felt more like an episode of The X-Files or maybe one of those old Hammer horror movies. Chill has largely disappeared from modern gaming tables, but in the 80s and 90s it was fairly easy to find it at game conventions. And Chill's adventures, while often pulpier and lighter weight than their Call of Cthulhu counterparts, were well liked by fans because they did capture the feel of a horror movie. They were easy to pull people into because they used themes and tropes that every gamer would know. And so in 1984, soon after the system itself was published, the adventure Highland Terror was released. In this adventure, players must travel across the Atlantic on the trail of an evil cult that is on the verge of summoning a god from eons past. Along the way, they'll deal with Celtic horrors, evil cultists, and maybe even the Loch Ness monster itself. Intrigued? Well, I was. I love Celtic mythology, Scotland, and horror that departs from the usual. So does Highland Terror deserve a spot at your table over 30 years after it was published? Or is it best tossed into the forgotten lake of RPG history? Well, grab your luggage and let's go, because not only am I going to give you a full review of Highland Terror, but I'll give you GMs some tips and tricks on how to run this adventure like a pro. Highland Terror is written by Gary Spiegel way back in 1984. It runs 32 pages. I finished it with my group in 2 sessions, but I skipped some of the smaller encounters. I kind of ran it a little faster. I imagine it would take most groups another session or 2 to finish, especially if they're running the entire thing as written. For such an old adventure, I'm impressed how complete it felt. It includes pre-generated characters, maps, and a single handout. I also think that it's interesting that the adventure suggests that it can run in either modern times, presumably the 1980s when it was written, or the Victorian era. I actually picked the Victorian era because I felt that an older gaslight tone worked better for this adventure. You really don't want mobile phones in this adventure, given the importance of travel, which you'll soon see. The setup of the adventure is this. The PC's occult investigators are contacted by Dr. Angus Gow, a professor of history at a small university in Glasgow. While researching connections between the Celts and India, he found evidence that an evil unknown entity was going to try to break into our world sometime soon near Loch Ness in Scotland. Afraid he's discovered a terrible secret, he writes the PCs with a lot of ambiguity, only saying that he's discovered something interesting about the Loch Ness monster and would like the PCs to visit him soon in Glasgow. The PC's organization buys them tickets on an ocean liner, the Susan Gale, and wishes them luck. But the professor, he really should have said more in his telegram, because he's right. Something terrible is slowly pushing into our world. A druidic cult has already summoned several horrors, led by the demigod Cernunnos, a shape-shifting nightmare that the druids are in league with. Cernunnos commands 3 monstrous servants, Cravect, a gaunt stag man, Zamiga, a skull-faced serpent creature, and Kralekt, a fleshless bull beast. Together, these horrors are working to tear open the final supernatural barrier near Loch Ness and unleash the Celtic monstrosity Lug. Think of him as a powerful Celtic elder god. He's eager to twist the minds of mankind the moment he crosses over. In just a few weeks, on the date of an ancient Celtic festival at the Temple of Lug in northern Scotland, Cernunnos plans to sacrifice 4 sacred horses and summon Lug after over 1,000 years of failed attempts. I found this to be a really interesting setup because it puts the PCs right in the middle of the action. In a typical Call of Cthulhu game, the players might be dealing with a cult attempting to summon a minion of Nyarlathotep. But here, the cultists have already largely succeeded. The powerful demigod Cernunnos, several of his horrific minions are already on the board. And the ritual is ready to go. There's no complexity left. They just have to get up to Scotland with some of these prized horses, kill them, and finish it. So the PCs are racing against something that will absolutely happen if they don't stop it. The first part of the adventure takes place on the ship, the Susan Gale. It takes 12 days to go from New York to Glasgow, after which the PCs can rendezvous with Professor Gow. You can see why I set this adventure in the Victorian era, because even with a vague threat, no sane modern players wouldn't just board an international flight and fly out to Glasgow right away. Yeah, so Professor Gow here says he wants to meet with us in Glasgow, something about the Loch Ness monster, and he wants us to take a 12-day cruise on a cargo ship to get there. Yeah, how about I just FaceTime him and tell him that we're gonna take British Airways instead? I think I got some status. The Susan Gale is actually a small cargo ship. Its cargo is mostly comprised of fine animals like sheep, horses, bulls. The PCs don't know this yet, but those horses are actually the prized Arabian horses, which are due to be sacrificed to summon Lug. There are also a few passengers on the ship. There's the captain and his crew, a traveling doctor, and the McCowan family, a cute family of 5 who's visiting relatives in Scotland. But also on the boat is Cernunnos himself, that evil shape-shifting demigod who's happy to hang out in the cargo hold in the shape of a bull the whole trip. But worse, that seemingly innocent McCowan family are actually his evil servants. They aren't even human. They are these doppelganger-like creatures called hook thalcoses who can take human form for a short while, but they're otherwise horrible creatures with wrinkled skin, bristly hair, red eyes, and giant hook hands. This is kind of cool because if the PCs observe the McGowan family, they'll never actually see them doing anything that requires fine motor skills with their fingers. As a GM, you should make sure you use that in your descriptions of them and see if the players catch on. Over the next 12 days at sea, the PCs face a tightening noose of terror. Every day, a crew member turns up dead, butchered by the McGowans as they slip in and out of their human forms. And then at night, Cernunnos torments the PCs with prophetic nightmares, visions that foreshadow the next day's horrors. Trapped aboard the ship, the PCs juggle murder investigations, sleepless dread, and the growing fear that they'll never reach Glasgow alive. In fact, in a really cool twist, a couple of days before landfill, just when the players are really believing that their dreams are coming true, Cernunnos delivers his most chilling dream yet. The ship will strike an iceberg and sink. Iceberg right ahead! My players totally panicked. They bought into the whole thing. They manned a lifeboat and fled, unable to convince the captain and crew to join them. They thought that the PCs were insane, which left my players adrift in a tiny boat at sea with the McGowans, who they did convince to go with them, who immediately turned into these monstrous forms and tried to kill them in a small lifeboat as the Susan Gale vanished into the mist. Well, friends, we barely escaped with our lives from that doomed ship. But fortunately, although we were unable to save the crew, we saved the McCowan family here with their kindness and gentleness and red eyes and drooling fangs. Somebody hand me my revolver. The voyage is a really fun part of this adventure. It's tense, it has cool villains and characters for the GM to use, and my players really enjoyed the feeling of being trapped while role-playing and investigating the murders. But there is just a gaping plot hole right here that some of you may have picked up on. You really need to fix it. Isn't it a massive coincidence that the PCs end up on the exact same boat as Cernunnos? Why the heck is a Celtic demigod hanging out in New York anyway? Was he at a Yankees game when his druid friends are like, hey, Cernunnos, it's time to summon Lug. Get your butt over here and we'll sacrifice some horses together. And then, while the evil doppelganger Hook-Thagases are creepy villains, I really like them, why are they killing people on this ship? Wouldn't it make more sense for them to behave, enjoy the cruise, get to Glasgow, and then just go on their merry way? And killing crew is a terrible idea when you need to go somewhere on time. What if the captain just turned the ship around and goes back to New York when murders start happening on the ship? I really just don't know how the author didn't spot and fix this coincidence. Maybe he planned for something else. I just don't know. And it just bugs me because patching this plot hole isn't exactly easy while still maintaining the fun parts of the adventure. So after some thought to make this work, I recommend you shift the backstory of the adventure. Because I set my version in the 1880s, I said that an ocean liner had just arrived in New York Harbor with cholera. The harbor was closed indefinitely while health inspectors and the quarantine hospital on Staten Island handled the situation. This is historically accurate, by the way. This kind of thing did happen. There was, however, a single cargo ship in Jersey City that was heading to Glasgow, had been cleared to leave, the Susan Gale. This explains why Cernunnos and the PCs all end up on the same ship. It was really the only choice. Second, when the PCs board the ship, I have the captain tell them that he just got contacted by the owner of the cargo on the ship, those sacrificial animals, and this guy paid to buy all the remaining passengers out of their tickets. Basically, he didn't want anyone else on the ship with Cernunnos. The captain's apologetic and admits he doesn't really understand this because no one's occupying the players' cabins. And of course, any group of PCs will not let this stand, and they will convince the captain to let them on board. They'll either bribe him or fast talk him into letting them onto the ship. So now, when the PCs suddenly talk their way on the ship, Cernunnos figures they have to be there to thwart him. And so he commands his servants, the McGowan family of the Hook-Thagases, to kill some crew, just the junior members, so that he can power up his ability to create nightmares, to not just give them bad dreams, but also to read their minds, discover their plans, and then drive them insane. So when the PCs start having horrible dreams, I also tell them that their minds feel violated, like someone's been digging into their thoughts and memories while simultaneously summoning their fears. And of course, once Cernunnos figures out that they are there to go to Glasgow and learn more about Loch Ness and Lug, he'll then have the McCowan family try to kill the PCs, or failing that, force them off the ship. These changes make this coincidence way less obvious, and it makes the Hook-Thagases murders seem more sensical. Eventually, whether the PCs arrive in Glasgow on the Susan Gale or they're picked up by some other ship while on a lifeboat, they begin part 2 of the adventure. They'll undoubtedly arrive in Glasgow and head to Professor Gale's apartment, where they discover that the professor and his associates have all been gruesomely shot and killed. But they will find a lot of clues at the apartment, including an old box with an ancient parchment that describes how the god Lug can be summoned by killing prized horses, a poem that describes the way old Celtic heroes have slain the minions of Lug, which is very helpful for later. They find a map that points to the remote Scottish island of Iona and a calendar that marks a sacred Celtic festival that's just a few days away. I do wish that there were more handouts here to give to players. The adventure really relies on the GM just describing this stuff, but it's all pretty clear and the players will figure something bad is going on in Iona in just a few days. And in case your players are really dense, the adventure allows for them to find a survivor of the attack, a young messenger who says his father was waiting to take them to Iona. This is a little ham-handed, and I didn't have to use this guy to lead my players to the next location. The clues in the apartment were plenty. The adventure then adds a little twist here where they have the police arrive to the scene of the professor's death. And between the murders on the ship, which have probably made the police a little more skeptical of the players' involvement, and now the death of the professor, the detectives here are beginning to think that the PCs are up to no good and may be involved somehow. And the police can even arrest and detain the PCs for a while to further burn down the clock. Once the players talk their way out of the situation with the detectives, they'll make their way to the Isle of Iona, where they find an old monastery. Here, a monk explains that he had corresponded with Professor Gale about an ancient monolith that was found on the island. This is where that monk had discovered that old box with the information on Lug in it. He had sent that box to the professor. There's also a lot to investigate here on the island with the monastery's records showing how it had once been attacked by cultists who were trying to restore the old Celtic gods, and how the monks forced the evil back to Loch Ness, which they call the Lake of the Beast. And studying that monolith more reveals more about the minions of Lug and the sacrifice of the horses that will summon him on the next festival day. Again, this adventure does a good job of overlapping clues, so even if your players haven't quite figured it out, by the time they investigate the Isle and the monastery, they should have a pretty clear idea there's a big sacrifice and elder god being summoned up in Loch Ness. Again, I do wish there were more handouts here showing the monoliths and the monks' diaries, etc., but again, everything's fairly well described. The final part of the adventure takes place in Loch Ness. This part is a little more open-ended, with the adventure suggesting that the PCs have to juggle the police who are up there who are still likely considering them suspects. There's an estate near the lake owned by a man, Devere Culloch, a druid, and the guy who arranged to bring the cargo over on the Susan Gale to sacrifice to Lug. He was the one that tried to kick the PCs off the ship, if you use my plot twist. The PCs may recognize his name if they did a good job investigating that cargo, and they'll probably pay him a visit. Otherwise, the GM will have to plant some clues to lead the PCs to his location. When I played, my players did miss that the cargo was connected to Devere Culloch, so I had to have the police explain to them when they showed up that several murders had happened on this guy's property in the last few years, including one in the last few days, a very suspicious death where a fisherman was horrifically gored by a stag. This captured my PC's attention, and they headed over to the estate. Devere knows that the PCs are investigating his cult, so he'll do the classic bad guy thing and invite them to dinner, learn more about their motivations, and then try to murder them, either poisoning them or unleashing his staff, the surviving hook thalcos from the ship, on them. Through Devere or his servants, the PCs will learn that nearby in the woods, the final preparations are being made for the summoning of Lug. And deep in the forest, they'll find a wooden altar surrounded by evil druids, several stallions ready to get sacrificed, and those three monstrous minions of Lug, Krevekt, Zamiga, and Kralekt. This ending is going to be a full-on monster mash, with the PCs having to confront evil druids, including some spellcasters, and those four monstrosities who have multiple powers and are very hard to take down. So you can see how this turns into a very pulp-style ending. If the PCs can't defeat the minions of Lug before those four horses are sacrificed, Lug will break into the world. Okay, I have to pause here because the adventure's conclusion is a little confusing as written. You see, it says that the PCs find the druids, the minions, and the horses in the forest surrounding that altar. But then the adventure also says that under the altar is a cave, which leads to a series of chambers with the minions and the horses and Lug's gate. It's almost like the author couldn't figure out where he wanted the ending, so we got two similar ones, one above ground and one below ground. I'm not even sure how you get horses underground. So I simplified this conclusion. I simply said that in the forest is the altar and the druids who are preparing to sacrifice the horses. The monstrous minions are below the earth in the cave, waiting to greet Lug as he breaks into the world from his gate. But if the PCs interrupt the forest ceremony in a loud and obnoxious way, the minions of Lug will emerge from the tunnels to attack them. This makes more sense to me at least, and when my players played it, they stealthily took out the druids up top and then snuck into the cave so they had to deal with the minions and making sure they didn't escape to go sacrifice the horses. But either way, this conclusion is a rough fight, as each of those minions is easily the same power as one of the PCs, and they all have special abilities like flying, stunning the PCs, and even animating the dead. The PCs had better come well armed to this encounter or have studied that poem that they may have found in the apartment, which reveals things that the three monstrous minions are vulnerable to. I like that this is not just a slugfest. There is a reward for players who spent time investigating their opponents here. They'll definitely have an advantage. If the PCs can stop Lug's summoning, congratulations, they've saved humanity from an evil Celtic elder god. But if they do not stop the summoning, which honestly is not unlikely given that the trigger is only a handful of dead horses, well then all hell breaks loose. Appearing from the gate is Lug, a massive snake-necked, wait for it, otter, who crashes into the world, cracks up the walls of the cave, and vanishes into Loch Ness. Okay, yes, he's a giant otter. This isn't so crazy. Hear me out here. Obviously, the adventure tries to tie together the Celtic god Lug and the Loch Ness monster. And the Loch Ness monster is often linked to otter sightings in the lake. So really, it's not that crazy that the bad guy's a giant otter. It's kind of creative. You just have to kind of describe it well so your players just don't start giggling. It's the Loch Ness monster! Actually, is that an otter? Oh, it's so cute. I kind of want to just pinch his cheeks. If Lug arrives, well, the adventure really leaves the GMs and players on their own. I guess they can sail after him on the lake, kind of like what's described on the cover. But this god has a ton of terrible powers. He can cause earthquakes in 1 mile radiuses, create illusions, even stop time. If you're playing this in a one-shot, you probably just want to say that he devours the PCs and destroys several towns and estates near the lake, and then just end the adventure there versus turn it into a tactical slugfest that the PCs are unlikely to win. And that's Highland Terror. So does it still hold up? Largely, I think it does. I like that unlike a lot of horror scenarios, it sends the PCs around from location to location around the globe. I like that there's open-ended areas, investigations, and some really fun and intense action scenes. The lore is pulled from Celtic folklore, but there's also some truly weird stuff in there that your players won't expect. I also found it pretty straightforward to port to pulp Call of Cthulhu, even without a lot of knowledge of the chill system, but I had to hand-wave some of those magical abilities that were unique to chill. The only real issues with this adventure is that big plot hole with Cernunnos, the hooked thalcos, and the cargo ship, which is fixable with just a little bit of planning like I described. And the ending, the two-part ending in the cave and the ground above, which I said, felt weirdly redundant, but again, pretty easy to fix. There are some parts of the adventure that feel underdeveloped, so I get the sense the author planned for more, but just wasn't able to include it. The human bad guys really aren't all that fleshed out. I'm not sure why they are being evil beyond just to be evil druids. The police investigating the PCs doesn't really pay off much, but it's a tool for the GM, and it's fun to have a recurring beleaguered police detective always show up when the PCs are in the middle of trouble. But really, these are minor issues that any experienced GM can work around. So in the end, I found Highland Terror a bit of a hidden gem. And if you ever stumble upon a copy, check it out. It's always fun when these RPG artifacts from decades past surprise you and still feel relevant. If you enjoyed this old school review and want to see more retro reviews like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you've ever played Chill or played this adventure, let me know what your experience was like. I'd love to hear war stories from people who've experienced both Call of Cthulhu and Chill and can tell me which ones they prefer for which kinds of adventures. Until next time, I'm JC, and just remember, if you see giant ripples forming on the water of Loch Ness, it's either the legendary monster itself or a very ambitious otter. Either way, you better run. There's going to be trouble there.